Hey guys, as we wind down tonight, we're going to drift back to a time when the wind wasn't just a passing inconvenience. In the Middle Ages, it was a presence, sometimes a nuisance, sometimes a messenger, and often something to fear. You're lying on a straw mattress in a drafty little cottage. The walls are thin enough that every sigh of air seeps through, carrying with it the sour tang of damp earth and the cold insistence that you don't truly belong here. The wind moves around you like a curious spirit, testing the cracks in the shutters, rustling your hair as though it's searching for something it's owed. Outside, it groans over the roof, pressing invisible hands against the door. People once believed that this wasn't weather at all, it was an omen, a punishment, a voice sent by unseen powers to remind you how small you were. You might think a good fire would solve this, that it would chase the chill away, hush the creaking timbers. But the reality is far more disappointing. Your hearth smoulders with damp logs, the smoke collecting in your throat while the wind whistles triumphantly through every gap it can find. You thought you were safe inside. The wind thinks otherwise. Maybe you'd expect to feel comforted by the thought that this was just a breeze, that it would pass. Instead, you find yourself listening for words in it, certain for a moment that you hear your own name whispered back to you. You might not survive this one. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to give the video a like and hit subscribe if you're truly enjoying the journey. You can also leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder to see people tuning in from so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, for that gentle hum in the background, and together, let's ease into tonight's story. You might imagine that when the night came, you could pull a blanket over your head and forget about the wind entirely. Perhaps you picture yourself cocooned in warmth, while the weather rages politely beyond your walls. But the truth is simpler and less reassuring. You're lying on a pallet stuffed with straw that smells like damp leaves and mouse breath. Each gust rattles the shutters like a determined burglar. You pull the blanket tighter, though it's really just a threadbare scrap pretending to be a shield. The walls are made of wattle, and daub, a fancy term for sticks smeared with mud that never quite dries. You can feel the cold pressing its long fingers through every seam, testing your resolve. Maybe you think the wind is just passing by, carrying on to bother someone else. But it lingers here, sliding under the door and coiling around your ankles like a bored cat with an appetite for toes. You try to convince yourself it isn't so bad. Perhaps the wind is cleansing, scouring away the day's sins and stale smells. But all it really does is swirl them into a fresher arrangement, so you can enjoy the tang of goat, soot, and last month's turnip soup with every breath. You tell yourself the wind can't hurt you, but you've heard the stories. Your neighbour swears the draft carries fevers in its invisible mouth. Old women insist that when the wind cries over the eaves, it's someone you love whispering goodbye. There's a moment just after the last embers die and before your eyes surrender when you imagine the wind has come solely to taunt you. It slithers through the thatch, lifts the corner of your blanket, and tickles the damp edge of your collar. You tuck it down again, but it finds another way in. It always does. Maybe you expect you'll get used to it, that by the third or fourth night your body will adapt. Wrong. Each evening feels like an uninvited inspection. The wind checks your patience, your nerve, and your ability to pretend you're not shivering. It's not enough that you're cold. You must also feel watched. Like the cottage itself has become a hollow ribcage, the wind puffing through it as though testing how empty you can stand to feel. And so you lie there in your little basket of sticks and straw, hoping the gusts will tire before you do. But they don't. The wind is tireless. It doesn't care how many blankets you stack or prayers you whisper. It just keeps coming, a reminder that no matter how many walls you build, you'll never be more than a guest in your own shelter. You might have believed that your roof, such as it was, would at least try to be loyal, that the layers of straw, reeds and hope piled thick above your head would work together to keep out the cold. But as the wind begins its slow, circling dance over the thatch, you quickly learn that the roof has other plans. It flexes and sighs, surrendering little flurries of dust and dry insects that sprinkle your face like the world's least appealing bedtime blessing. In the daylight, you'd looked up and thought it seemed solid enough. That illusion was a kindness the morning gave you, which night immediately revoked. Every breeze pries up a corner, every stronger gust lifts a patch the size of your hand and slides the wind's chill straight down your neck. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine the roof has become a living creature, a giant, slow-breathing animal that wheezes drafts into your blankets whenever it's bored. You try to wedge a stick into the gap above your head, thinking it will hold the thatch in place. But the wind is an opportunist. It waits until you settle again, then slips in beside you with a triumphant little hiss. Maybe you thought the worst that could happen was a wet patch dripping on your pillow. Wrong. You discover that sometimes the roof simply decides it's done. It sags, leaks, and occasionally offers you a small avalanche of loose straw that lands on your chest with the damp finality of a resigned sigh. You pull the blanket higher, but it only does so much. The cloth is thin as a nun's patience, and smells faintly of damp wool and old onions. Even wrapped tight, you feel the wind prodding you, seeking your skin like a curious finger. If you were wealthy, you'd have a roof tiled in slate, maybe even walls thick enough to blunt the gale. But you aren't wealthy, so you live in a place where the difference between indoors and outdoors is more about optimism than architecture. At some point long after you should be asleep, you start whispering little bargains to the rafters. You promise to patch them properly next spring, to weave the straw tighter, to stop cursing the carpenter's memory every time the wind finds you. But the roof doesn't care. It was built to fail you eventually, and the wind is just helping it along. You close your eyes, thinking if you pretend not to notice it will stop, but it doesn't. The cold works its way beneath your blanket, down your spine, across your knees. It finds the tender place between your shoulder blades and lingers there, as though it's curious to see how much longer you can pretend it's not winning. And all the while, you can't help but picture the roof as an old friend who never liked you, finally showing its true opinion in the language of groans and falling straw. You might believe that a blanket, however threadbare, has one simple purpose: to keep you warm. But in your medieval cottage, your blanket is a decorative suggestion more than a useful object. You tug it over your shoulders, feeling the familiar gritty texture against your skin, a texture that implies it has been washed approximately never. It smells of lanolin and last autumn's mildew, like an elderly sheep that recently discovered existential despair. You imagine this thin cover will somehow hold the wind at bay, as if it were a rampart of wool against the advancing cold. But the blanket seems to take offense at your optimism. It slides off your shoulder whenever you move, sulks down to your knees, or bunches into a lumpy barricade that protects everything except the parts of you that are actually cold. You adjust it again, hoping this time it will settle. But no, it's a petulant creature, determined to remind you that ownership does not mean obedience. At first, you think perhaps the wind will tire before you do, that eventually it will wander off to torment someone else. But the gusts only gather strength. They slip under the blanket's frayed edge, swirling against your ribs like a cold tongue that never learns manners. You consider layering another cover, but the only other options are an itchy sack that used to hold grain or your cloak, still damp from the afternoon drizzle. The expectation of comfort hovers just out of reach. You thought you'd pull the blanket over your head and drift to sleep. Instead, you spend the hours measuring how long you can lie perfectly still before the wind's sly fingers find a new gap. Your patience stretches thin as your blankets weave, and there is a peculiar intimacy in your misery. The wind has learned every contour of your body. It knows the hollow beneath your throat, the curve of your hip, the tender place behind your knee. It seeks these places out with the persistence of a tax collector who smells a hidden coin. Maybe you try to tell yourself that it could be worse. You could have no blanket at all, but the thought is more irritating than comforting. Because this blanket doesn't feel like protection, it feels like a collaborator, thinly siding with the cold against you. You find yourself glaring into the darkness, quietly accusing the inanimate cloth of betrayal. By morning, you'll be certain you spent the night locked in a polite struggle with both the wind and the blanket. The blanket will win. It always does. It will slip down your shins and tangle your ankles until you wake shivering, the dawn glinting through the gaps in the roof you meant to patch last summer. And you'll wonder, not for the first time, why a piece of fabric you own insists on hating you so completely. You might assume the wind's howl would drown out every other sound, that its ceaseless wailing would at least offer the small mercy of masking the rest of the cottage's complaints. But the opposite is true. The wind doesn't silence anything, it simply sets the stage for a private concert of creaks, drips and nameless scratches that continue long after you wish they'd stop. It begins with the roof timbers. They moan with the slow exhaustion of ancient bones, flexing under the pressure of each gust. The first time you hear it, you think the house might be collapsing in dignified protest. But no, it's just the timber remembering every storm it has ever survived. You might expect you'll grow used to this mournful chorus, but each groan arrives unpredictably, like a cough in the dark that reminds you you're never quite alone. Then there's the loose shutter. By daylight you promise yourself you'll nail it shut, wedge a scrap of wood in the hinge. But in the darkness, you simply lie there as it bangs gently against the wall with each new gust. The rhythm is maddening. It goes silent just long enough to make you believe it's over, then starts up again with the persistence of a child determined to wake you at dawn. You pull your blanket higher, though it doesn't help. Because now you're aware of the scratching. Somewhere between the rafters and the thatch, something small and tenacious is investigating the roof. Perhaps it's a mouse or a bird, or a creature you'd rather not name for fear it will feel invited. It scuttles with purpose, like a tiny inspector noting all the ways your house is failing. You try to pretend you don't hear it. You fail. Expectation tells you that once you close your eyes, sleep will claim you out of pity. Reality informs you that sleep has standards your cottage does not meet. You shift on your straw pallet, trying to find a position that feels secure. But each movement sets off a fresh chorus, your joints crack, the straw rustles, and somewhere above, the invisible tenant in the roof shifts to a new perch to better supervise your insomnia. Perhaps the worst sound is the quiet. That long, unbroken hush, after the wind dies down for a moment. You expect relief. What you get is the awareness of your own breathing, the cold filling your lungs, the soft wheeze of damp straw exhaling beneath you. You're left to wonder if the wind was ever the problem, or merely the distraction from everything else that is wrong with this place. And in that silent interval before the next gust rattles the shutters, you realize you have memorized the noises of the night. The roof's weary sighs, the timid scratching, the hollow thump of loose boards. It is your nightly symphony, and no matter how you brace yourself, you will always be its unwilling audience. You might convince yourself that drafts are simple things, just bits of air wandering through cracks without malice. But after a few nights in this cottage, you start to suspect that the drafts here have personalities. They're not content to pass by unnoticed. They insist on making themselves known, slipping along your skin like inquisitive ghosts determined to learn your secrets. You lie still, hoping the chill will move on if you pretend to be furniture. Instead, it intensifies. A thin, icy tendril slides up your sleeve, touches the back of your neck, and waits. The sensation is so precise that you'd almost swear the draft is whispering something you're not quite brave enough to understand. Maybe it's asking why you thought this cottage was shelter. Maybe it's reminding you that nature doesn't care how tired you are. Earlier, you tried to block the biggest gaps with an old tunic and a clump of straw. You wedged them into the cracks with the hopeful determination of someone who still believes small efforts can matter. But the wind was amused. It simply found another way in curling around the edges of the shutter, slipping beneath the door, and finally discovering the gap in the wall where a knot in the timber fell out last spring. You promised yourself you'd fix it. You didn't. And now, the draft makes certain you won't forget. Expectation tells you that once you're fully under the blanket, you're safe. Reality delivers a cold fingertip pressing against your ribs. You shift away, but the chill follows, persistent as a tax collector with a personal vendetta. You pull the blanket tighter and tuck your feet up, hoping to protect the warmest parts of yourself. The draft is unimpressed. It just slides higher until you feel it lingering along your cheek. There's a moment, right before you surrender to sleeplessness, when you're certain the draft is calling your name. Not aloud, but in the way it insists on your attention. You try to ignore it, but it's impossible. The cold has a voice, and it knows precisely how to find you. Perhaps you imagine that dawn will make things better, that the sun will melt this sly visitor and leave you in peace. But dawn in a medieval cottage is only slightly less miserable than night. The drafts don't vanish. They simply change their tone from accusation to mockery. You roll over, hoping the other side of the pallet will be warmer. It isn't. It smells faintly of damp rushes and regret. And so you lie there resigned. The draft is your companion now. It will stay until you move, and even then it will follow. Because in this place, every crack in the wall is an invitation, and the wind never declines an invitation. You might think of fire as a simple eylie, a flickering little heart of warmth that asks for nothing more than wood and attention. But in your medieval cottage, the fire is less a comfort and more a finicky monarch that rules the room on its own terms. You coax it to life in the early evening, feeding it precious sticks you've hoarded like a desperate magpie. For a while, it pretends to care. Flames dance, embers glow, and you almost believe you'll stay warm through the night. But as darkness thickens, the fire begins to sulk. You might expect it to burn bright and steady. Wrong. It flickers out whenever you look away, as if offended by your inattention. The logs smoke more than they blaze, sending up frail wisps that circle the rafters before curling into your nose. You cough. The fire crackles back, unimpressed by your discomfort. Expectation tells you that if you sit close enough, the warmth will sink into your bones and stay there. Reality proves otherwise. The moment you retreat to your pallet, the heat slips away, leaving you as cold as when you started. The fire's glow seems to shrink out of spite, as though it knows you have no more wood to offer. You try to console yourself with the small embers still pulsing in the hearth, each a red eye that promises to survive the night. But the wind creeping through the gaps has other plans. It prowls along the floorboards, licking at the coals until they fade to sullen lumps. You wrap your blanket tighter, listening to the fire's last sighs. And that's when you notice the smell. It's the particular reek of damp wood failing to combust, part swamp, part disappointment. You thought the fire would drive the cold away. Instead, it has simply made the air taste of wet ash. You get up, your feet slapping the packed earth, and prod the embers with a charred stick. A single spark flares up, hopeful, then dies. You whisper a quiet plea, just enough warmth to outlast the night. But the fire ignores you, content to smoulder in its own sulk. Perhaps you imagine dawn will reward your persistence. That if you tend the embers carefully enough, you'll have something to build on in the morning. But when the first light spills across the floor, you find only a cold pit of blackened cinders. The fire has abandoned you completely. A final petty gesture that leaves you shivering in the grey hush of dawn. And in that moment, you understand the wind isn't your only enemy. Even the fire has joined the conspiracy to remind you that comfort is a privilege you don't possess. You might tell yourself that once you're off your feet, the floor no longer matters, that the packed dirt beneath your pallet is merely a surface, neither friend nor foe. But the floor in your medieval cottage is a quiet conspirator in your nightly discomfort. By day, it's only an inconvenience, a place to drop firewood or scatter straw. By night, it becomes a slow, merciless sink for every scrap of warmth you manage to collect. Perhaps you thought the ground would stay neutral. After all, you're not asking much, just that it refrain from feeling like a block of winter itself pressed against your spine. But it has other ambitions. As soon as the last ember fades, the cold begins its steady ascent. It creeps up through your straw bedding, soaking into your blanket, coiling around your legs until you feel as if you've been left to sleep in a shallow grave dug for your optimism. Expectation whispers that if you keep still, your own heat will be enough. Reality demonstrates otherwise, pressing icy tendrils between your toes no matter how tightly you curl them. You try to tuck your feet under the fold of your cloak, but the cold simply slips around the edges, a damp insinuation that it will always find you. The smell doesn't help. The floor is a pungent record of every misfortune that has occurred here. A bit of spilled broth from last week, a damp patch where the roof dripped for hours, the vague sourness of mud mixed with livestock memory. You bury your nose in the blanket, only to find it carries its own bouquet of regret. When you shift, the straw rustles with the brittle music of old rushes. You can't decide if the sound is more embarrassing or depressing. Maybe you expected that layering the bedding would help, that an extra mat would soften the sensation of sleeping on a slab of frozen disappointment. Wrong again. The floor's chill is patient, determined to seep upward until it reaches your heart. You think briefly of standing up, of pacing the tiny room to warm your blood. But the moment your bare soles touch the packed earth, you abandon the idea. The floor is colder than the air, a flat expanse of malice waiting to claim you the instant you let your guard down. And so you remain there, twisted into the least uncomfortable shape you can manage, wondering how something so ordinary a patch of dirt can hate you with such consistent determination. In the small hours, you start to suspect the floor has always been waiting for this moment, for your fire to die and your courage to fade, so it can resume its campaign of quiet conquest. By dawn, your feet are numb, your back is aching, and your respect for the floor has curdled into a kind of grudge. You know it will be there tomorrow night, patient as ever, ready to resume the same cold argument you have no hope of winning. You might expect the door of your little cottage roughly hewn, though it is to do at least one thing: shut. A solid barrier against the wind, a polite refusal to the night outside. But the first time you latch it, you discover it's more suggestion than guarantee. The wood is warped by too many damp winters and too many careless hinges. Even when you press it firmly into place, there remains a thumb-width gap along the edge, a gap that stares back at you like an indifferent eye. You shove a rag into the crack, hoping that will stop the wind's curiosity. For a moment you think it's worked. The draft eases. You allow yourself a small, fragile sense of victory. But expectation is a treacherous companion. A stronger gust slides the rag aside, and the wind returns with the triumphant smugness of a dog finding an unguarded roast. It's not only the cold that seeps in. The door carries every sound from outside: night birds shrieking like insulted souls, the distant bark of a dog that has never liked you, the sigh of bare branches rattling against the eaves. Even the ordinary noises feel amplified by that little opening, as though the night itself has leaned closer to gossip. You pull your blanket around your ears, trying to convince yourself that as long as the door remains physically in its frame, you're safe. But the wind has no respect for your illusions. It slides under the door in long, invisible ribbons, wrapping around your ankles with the intimacy of a forgotten lover. Expectation whispers that dawn will lessen the problem. Reality assures you that daylight only reveals how poorly the door fits. You can see the crooked line where it fails to meet the jamb, the splintered edge where someone tried and failed to mend it. You promise yourself you'll fix it come spring, though deep down you suspect you'll only remember this promise the next time the wind comes calling. And there is something about that gap, small though it is, that makes the rest of the cottage feel suddenly vulnerable. If the door can't manage its single purpose, what hope do the walls have? What trust can you place in the roof that sighs at every breeze? By the middle of the night, you're sure the door is no longer an object. It's a character in this quiet disaster, smirking at your attempts to pretend you live in a house, rather than a politely arranged collection of regrets and excuses. You lie there, watching the gap, certain that if you blink too long, the wind will decide to step fully inside and join you. And when morning comes, and you fumble the latch open with stiff fingers, the door swings wide in the cold light. No resistance, no apology. Just that blank, passive expression of wood that has never cared whether you stayed warm or not. You might imagine that if the walls failed and the door refused to cooperate, at least the ceiling would maintain some dignity, a last thin veil between you and the howling sky. But in your medieval cottage, the ceiling is more like an aging relative who can no longer keep their opinions to themselves. It creaks, sighs, and then inevitably lets something fall. At first, it's only dust. A soft, almost considerate sprinkle that drifts onto your blanket and settles into your hair. You brush it away, telling yourself it's harmless, just old straw shedding the memory of last summer. But then come the bits of thatch. A husk here, a clump there. You expect it will stop once the wind calms. Wrong. The stronger the gusts, the more eager the ceiling becomes to share whatever it's hiding. Expectation reassures you that the roof is intact. Reality shows you the stars through the gap where a bundle of reeds has quietly abandoned its post. You lie on your back, watching the cold sky peer in like an uninvited guest. You pull the blanket higher, feeling absurdly exposed. There's a draft now with its own personality, sharp, insistent, and apparently fascinated by your face. When you close your eyes, you try to pretend the ceiling isn't plotting. But the next pattern of debris lands square on your cheek. A brittle, precise little announcement. You will never win this argument. Perhaps you think that sealing the hole with a scrap of cloth will solve the problem. But the wind is clever. It tugs the rag free, letting it flutter to the floor like a surrender flag you didn't know you were waving. Expectation tells you that eventually you'll grow accustomed to this small avalanche. Reality delivers each fresh sprinkle as a reminder that nothing in this place is secure. You cough, and a puff of dust drifts into your mouth, tasting of old grass and the slow decay of years you didn't live through. There's a moment, somewhere near dawn, when you find yourself bargaining with the ceiling. You promise to fix it in the spring, to patch the gaps, to treat it with the respect it apparently demands. The ceiling responds with another quiet cascade of straw. And it's in that moment, lying half buried under your own roof, that you realize the wind is merely the messenger. The true betrayal comes from above. The ceiling doesn't protect you, it waits patiently for the chance to collapse, to lay its secrets in your lap, and to remind you that no matter how carefully you build a shelter, there will always be something watching, waiting, and ready to fall. You might comfort yourself in the long, shivering hours by promising that dawn will bring relief, that the first streaks of light creeping through the gaps in the thatch will feel like rescue, like some benevolent force has finally arrived to end the night's petty humiliations. But when morning comes, it brings no triumph. Just a slow, grey unveiling of every small defeat you endured in the dark. The first thing you notice is your blanket, or rather, where your blanket isn't. It has migrated to the far side of the pallet, curled up like a sulking cat refusing to share your misery. You reach for it, your fingers stiff as sticks left too long in the frost. It smells of cold sweat and sour wool. You pull it back over your shoulders, but it's too late. The chill has already soaked into you like ink into old parchment. Expectation tells you the rising sun will banish the draft. Reality offers you a soft breeze with the same cold, familiar malice as the night. The wind has simply changed its costume from shrieking darkness to daylight mockery. It slips under the door in a new, polite tone, tapping at your ankles like a creditor reminding you the debt is still unpaid. You sit up, feeling every place where the straw mattress pressed against your skin, leaving you with lines of aching numbness. The floor greets your feet with its usual damp indifference. You expect to find the hearth with a few embers still bravely alive. Wrong again. The ashes are as cold as everything else, and when you nudge them with a stick, they collapse in a small puff of defeat. You look around your cottage as the grey light sharpens, and you realize nothing here has changed. The gap in the door still gapes. The hole in the thatch still watches you. The walls still lean inward like they've overheard your most embarrassing thoughts and would rather not hold them up any longer. You wrap the blanket tighter, though you know it will betray you again by evening. Expectation tells you that if you move around briskly, you'll feel warmer. Reality proves that the cold isn't something you can shake off, it's something that stays in your bones, patient as a grudge. You rub your arms, listening to your own teeth chattering like a small orchestra of regret. There is, in this moment, a peculiar dignity in the fact that you survived another night. A victory so meager it feels like a joke. You're still here, still cold, still watched by the wind and the roof and the door that never cared if you were comfortable. And as you stand there, in the thin grey hush of a medieval dawn, you understand that survival isn't always triumphant. Sometimes it's just a matter of enduring one draft, one shiver, one disappointed sunrise at a time. You might believe that people in the Middle Ages had more pressing concerns than blaming each other for the wind. After all, there were plagues to dodge, taxes to surrender, and bread that tasted like old barn floors. But fear is a resourceful thing. When the storm came shrieking through the village, ripping thatch from rooftops and tossing chickens into ditches, it didn't take long for someone to suggest it wasn't just bad weather. No, it was a curse. And so, in the damp morning after the gale, you find yourself standing among your neighbours, all of you peering at the wreckage like bewildered hens. The wind has done its work well. Fences lean drunkenly against churned-up mud. Roof beams jut at odd angles like broken ribs. You expect someone will begin repairs. Instead, the murmuring starts. Expectation tells you that reason will prevail, that everyone will sigh, curse the storm, and fetch hammers. Reality proves that suspicion grows faster than mold in a damp cellar. Before noon, the whispers have a name: an elderly woman with joints as twisted as the hedgerows. A woman who lives alone in a hut that smells of old onions and dried rosemary. You know her. She once gave you a salve for a burn that almost helped. But now, you watch as eyes narrow and heads tilt in her direction. The accusation starts small. Someone mutters that she was seen collecting herbs at dusk. Someone else claims she spoke to the wind in a voice too soft to be prayer. You stand there, blanket still wrapped around your shoulders, and feel the cold draft of dread as surely as last night's storm. Expectation insists that no one will believe such nonsense. But you see how quickly it spreads. The story grows legs, sprouting new details with every retelling. Now she wasn't just gathering plants, she was whispering curses. Now she wasn't simply old, she was consorting with dark forces. By evening, the village has gathered outside her door. The wind has finally stilled, but you'd almost prefer it howling to this uneasy silence. You watch as a man steps forward, holding a length of rope. His voice is low but firm, accusing her of bringing the storm, of tearing roofs from homes and sending the wind to punish the righteous. You expect she will deny it. She doesn't. She only stares at the ground, as if she's tired of explaining things no one wants to hear. Expectation says someone will intervene. Reality reminds you that fear, once woken, rarely goes back to sleep willingly. You watch as she's led away, her steps slow and steady, as though she's walking through a scene she rehearsed in dreams. The villagers follow in a quiet procession. You trail behind, the last reluctant witness to a trial that has already decided its verdict. And in the grey hush that falls over the road, you understand something unsettling. The wind was never the real threat. It was merely the excuse people needed to reveal the suspicions they'd been nursing all along. You might think that proving a woman caused the wind would require evidence, some scrap of logic, or at least a confession scratched onto a wax tablet. But as you stand in the crowded hall, watching the villagers shuffle closer to the hearth, you realize proof is a luxury no one here has patience for. They have a story, and it will be enough. Expectation tells you that someone will speak up, remind the crowd that storms visit everyone, that the wind doesn't take orders from old women with reshumi eyes and a knack for drying herbs. But no voice interrupts the accusations. Instead, a man with hands like knotted ropes stands beside the hearth and recounts how he saw her outside the night the gale began. She was scattering something, seeds, he claims, or maybe ashes. His certainty grows with every sentence. By the time he finishes, you're almost convinced you saw her too. Another woman adds that she's heard muttering from the old hut in the evenings, a language no Christian would recognize. You remember passing that same hut on market day, how she was humming to herself as she mended a basket. In the soft light, it had seemed harmless. Now, as everyone shifts uncomfortably and avoids your gaze, it feels more sinister than you'd ever imagined. Expectation assures you that memory is reliable. Reality demonstrates how quickly it buckles under pressure. Each person steps forward to share a small story. She refused a gift of cheese. Her cat looked at them sideways. She once told a neighbor the weather would turn wet. That last one seems to land hardest, a simple prediction transformed into a declaration of malice. When it's your turn to speak, you feel your mouth go dry. You could say you never saw her do anything but help the sick and mend the roofs no one else would touch. You could say the wind doesn't need an invitation to tear the village apart. But you look around the room, see the fear bristling like thorns in every face, and find you don't want it turned in your direction. So you say nothing. Expectation whispers that silence is neutral. Reality shows you that silence is agreement. When the elder finally pronounces that she will be tested tied to a chair, lowered into the cold pond, you know the verdict was decided before dawn. The ritual is not about discovering truth. It's about satisfying the dread that has coiled around this place like a vine. And as the crowd begins to file out, you feel the wind slip in through the cracks, cold and unbothered by the commotion it supposedly caused. It doesn't care if you name it an omen or a curse. It will keep blowing, keep shaking the rafters, keep reminding you that fear always needs someone to blame. You might expect that if you rose early enough, you could avoid witnessing what came next, that you could slip away to the fields or find some urgent task requiring your absence. But when the morning breaks, grey and unsympathetic, you find yourself among the cluster of neighbours trudging toward the pond. It feels as though the entire village has decided to share this ritual of unease. The pond itself is nothing special, an oval of cold water, framed by reeds that bow under the weight of yesterday's storm. In summer, you've seen children catch frogs here, their laughter drifting across the fields. But this morning, no one laughs. Expectation tells you that places are just places. Reality insists that when enough frightened eyes stare at the same patch of water, it can become something else entirely. The old woman sits on a low stool, her hands bound in her lap, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. You think she looks smaller than you remember, her spine bent as though she's already carrying the verdict she hasn't heard yet. A man you barely know holds the rope. His knuckles are white where he grips it, as if he's afraid the wind will snatch him away next if he lets go. Someone begins to speak a prayer or a charge, you can't tell. The words drift over the pond, thin as frost, while the rest of you shuffle your feet and pretend you aren't cold. You expect she'll protest, deny the accusations, raise her voice to remind everyone that storms have come and gone long before she was born. But she doesn't look up. Perhaps she knows there is no sentence lighter than the one already waiting in the crowd's eyes. Expectation suggests that this ritual will be solemn, that the village will treat the moment with gravity. Reality delivers a series of petty distractions, a child crying because his hands are cold, a rooster crowing in the distance, as if announcing the absurdity of it all, the wind tugging at your hood, and small, persistent reminders that nothing here is sacred. At the signal, two men step forward and lift her by the arms. You watch as her feet leave the ground, the frayed hem of her skirt brushing the mud. You expect you'll look away. Instead, you stare, fascinated by the ordinariness of it. The pond ripples under the morning breeze, a dull mirror reflecting every face along the bank. And there's a moment just before she's lowered in, when you feel certain the pond itself is watching, that the water has been waiting all night, patient and indifferent, ready to decide whether she sinks or floats, ready to confirm what everyone here has already decided to believe. Expectation whispers that you'll forget this by next winter, that it will fade into the background noise of countless other miseries. But as you stand there, shivering in the hush, you suspect you'll remember the sound of the rope uncoiling for the rest of your life. You might believe that the purpose of lowering her into the pond is to discover the truth, to see whether she will float, whether the water itself will betray her guilt. But as you stand among the watching villagers, you understand this isn't about water or witches. It's about fear dressing up as certainty. Expectation tells you the ritual will be swift, that the cold will shock her into confession or absolution. Reality stretches time into thin, unbearable threads. The rope goes taut in the men's hands as she descends. The water is so cold it steams in the weak morning sun. You expect she will scream. She doesn't. Only a single breath escapes her, visible as a small cloud before the pond closes over her shoulders. A collective sigh passes through the crowd. You feel it in your own lungs, though you'd rather not admit you're part of it. Everyone leans closer, as though proximity will grant them the proof they crave. The surface ripples around her, reeds bending as if bowing to the performance. Expectation insists that someone will call a halt, that compassion will intervene, but no one moves. You watch as her head tips back, her face turned to the grey sky. The rope creaks, a slow complaint that seems louder than the whispers. For a moment, you imagine you hear her voice, a soft, resigned apology drifting under the water's hush. Then she sinks, just enough that her chin disappears beneath the surface. A woman near you gasps, clutching her hands to her mouth. Another man mutters that this is proof she is innocent, that the water has accepted her. You'd expect relief to spread, maybe a tearful apology, a scramble to pull her up, but the crowd only shifts in place, uncertain what to do with a verdict that doesn't fit the story they've rehearsed. Expectation suggests the rope will tighten, that they will haul her out into the morning air. Reality allows the moment to stretch on, an awkward pause in a play no one quite believes in. You clear your throat, but no sound comes out. The wind rustles the reeds again, as if eager to remind everyone that the storm never needed her help to exist. At last, someone steps forward and tugs the rope. She emerges coughing, her shawl plastered to her shoulders, her hair straggling in dark ropes. You'd expect her to plead, to wail, to insist she is blameless. But she only looks at the ground as if she's already somewhere you can't follow. Expectation whispers that you'll feel better now the ordeal is over. Reality presses a quiet shame against your ribs, heavier than the cold. You wrap your blanket tighter, not for warmth, but for something to hold onto as the wind slides past your cheek, unimpressed by everything you've done to tame it. You might think that after a test like this so public, so final, some certainty would settle over the crowd. That, watching her pulled from the pond, dripping and shivering, would be enough to satisfy whatever hunger brought everyone here at dawn. But as she stands before them, shoulders bent under the weight of her wet shawl, you realize the truth. No ritual ever satisfies fear. It only delays it. Expectation suggests that now she's proven innocent, they will let her go. That the rope will be unknotted, and someone will step forward to offer a cloak or a hand. Reality shows you the hesitant, frowning faces. The crowd shifts from foot to foot, each person quietly deciding they don't believe the result. If the storm was punishment, then someone must deserve it, and she still seems the most convenient explanation. You watch her blinking against the drizzle that has begun to fall, just enough to dampen your hair and blur your vision. The elder steps forward again. His voice sounds weary, almost apologetic, as he says they will keep her confined, just in case. Just in case the wind returns. Just in case the pond was tricked. Just in case the sky itself has decided to test their resolve. Expectation whispers that someone, maybe you, will finally protest. You open your mouth, but the words die in your throat. You're tired, and the wind has been whispering in your ears all night. The effort it takes to say nothing is less than the effort it would take to argue, and you are, like everyone here, afraid to find the fear redirected toward yourself. The old woman doesn't look surprised. She only nods once, as though she suspected this was how it would end from the moment the gale tore the roof from her hut. You think she looks more relieved than angry, as if the waiting was worse than the verdict itself. Expectation tells you the drizzle will clear, that the sky will soften and let the sun through. Reality delivers a steady, soaking chill that seeps through your blanket and into your bones. The wind circles your ankles, stirring the puddles where her footprints already begin to fill with rain. No one speaks as they lead her away. The rope is looped around her wrists again, though loosely, as though they hope this small courtesy will make the accusation feel less cruel. It doesn't. You know it doesn't because no one will look at her. They stare instead at the pond, at their shoes, at the thin line of smoke curling from a distant chimney. Anywhere but her face. Expectation tells you this will pass, that by harvest time the storm will be a memory, and she will return to her hut. Reality informs you that the memory will never fade. It will stay lodged in the soft part of your mind like a splinter, reminding you that it doesn't take much, just a wind, a rumor, and an hour at dawn to turn neighbors into accusers. And as you follow the others back along the muddy path, you feel the drizzle turn to rain. You look up, hoping the clouds might offer an apology for all the trouble. But the sky only blinks its blank grey eye, unmoved by your search for meaning. You might expect that, after the crowd drifts away, some echo of their presence would remain, a murmur on the air, a faint warmth from so many bodies packed close together. But once the last figure disappears around the bend, the clearing by the pond empties with remarkable speed. It's as if the earth itself is relieved to be rid of you all. Expectation tells you that you'll leave too, that your feet will carry you down the muddy path after the others, but you find yourself rooted in place, staring at the pond as the rain stitches delicate ripples across its surface. The rope trails in the water where they dropped it, the end floating like the limp tail of some tired creature. The sky has settled into a steady, indifferent drizzle, the kind that seeps into your hood and slides down the back of your neck, finding the last warm spot between your shoulders. You shiver, but you don't move. You expect you'll feel relief now that the trial has concluded. Reality sends you only a hollow quiet, the sort that hums just behind your ears. For a moment you wonder if you should pick up the rope, some small gesture to prove you aren't like the others. But you don't, because you know, deep down, you are exactly like them. You were glad it wasn't you accused. You were grateful the storm found another scapegoat. That is the part you will remember later, the thought you'll replay when the wind comes again. Expectation suggests you'll forget these hours. That time will smooth them into a story you can tell yourself with less shame. But even as you stand there, you suspect the memory will remain stubborn, like a stain on your hands you can't wash off. A crow calls from the trees beyond the pond, the sound abrupt in the hush. You look up, half expecting the sky to open, to swallow you for your cowardice. But nothing happens. The drizzle falls. The reeds sway. The pond keeps its secrets. When you finally step back, your heel sinks into the soft earth, leaving a print that immediately fills with rainwater. You imagine the mark will remain long after you've gone, a small evidence that you were here and did nothing. Expectation tells you the village will move on. The roofs will be patched, the fields replanted, and life will reassemble itself into the shape it wore before the storm. Reality assures you that nothing will quite return to how it was. There will always be a small suspicion coiled in every greeting, a thin seam of guilt beneath every conversation. And as you turn away, you feel the wind pick up again, just enough to remind you that no matter who you blame or bind or cast into the pond, it will keep coming. Unimpressed by your rituals, unmoved by your fear, you might expect that once you turned your back on the pond, the road would feel familiar again, that the path winding between hedgerows and sodden ditches would greet you with the small comfort of routine. But each step feels unfamiliar, as though the storm reshaped everything in your absence. The rain has softened the track into a grey soup. Your boots, if you can still call them, that sink to the ankle with every stride, making a quiet sucking sound that seems louder in the hush. You try not to look back, but you feel the pond pressing at your spine, an accusation you carry whether you face it or not. Expectation tells you the air will freshen once you leave the clearing. Reality delivers the same damp, needling cold, the drizzle soaking your hair until it clings in ropes against your temples. You tell yourself you'll feel warmer when you reach the village, but the chill has become a second skin. Along the way, you pass the wreckage the storm left behind, fences flattened like broken combs, a cart tipped sideways in the ditch, the thatch from someone's roof draped across a hedge as if it tried to flee and got no further. You imagine the wind laughing at these small indignities, and you almost laugh too. Almost. Expectation insists that when you return, someone will be waiting, that a fire will be crackling in your hearth, a neighbour will nod in quiet understanding, a cup of something hot will be offered to thaw your hands. Reality finds your cottage exactly as you left it, cold, dim, with the door ajar in an attitude of mild disgust. You step inside, dripping onto the packed earth. The rushes underfoot are damp, the air smells of stale smoke, and the faint sourness of your own uneaten supper. You expect the place to feel safe, but it only feels smaller, as though the walls have shifted a finger's width closer in your absence. You crouch by the hearth, coaxing a flame from the last scraps of kindling. The fire flares up, then flickers back to a sullen glow, as unimpressed with your efforts as the pond was. You hold your hands to it, but the heat feels ceremonial, not generous like a polite gesture, rather than a real attempt to warm you. Expectation suggests that sleep will find you easily after such a morning. But you sit there, elbows on your knees, listening to the wind slip around the doorframe. You know that when you lie down, you'll see her face behind your eyelids. Not accusing, just tired. The way she looked when they tied the rope around her wrists again. And somewhere between the last embers and the first real darkness, you will try to convince yourself you had no choice, that you were only a witness, that you did nothing because there was nothing to be done. Expectation promises this story will fade. That time will scuff the edges until it becomes just another tale told over ale in the dark months. But as you close your eyes, reality settles across your shoulders like another damp blanket, whispering that some stories never grow lighter no matter how many years you carry them. You might think that after the pond, after the rope, after the quiet walk home, the story would be over, that the village would slip back into the weary rhythm of survival, the storm forgotten under the daily press of chores and obligations. But stories are like weeds, they thrive in the cracks you don't bother to fill. Expectation tells you that people will tire of the topic, that their curiosity will dull. Reality unfolds differently. By dusk, you can hear voices drifting through the walls of your cottage, speculation spun into certainty. She was seen with a blackbird perched on her shoulder. Someone insists. She sang to the wind in a tongue no one recognized. She knew the storm was coming days before it arrived. You sit by the cold hearth, hands clasped, listening to each new invention. Every repetition polishes the tale until it gleams, smooth and convincing. You expect someone will challenge the stories, but no one wants to be the first to sound doubtful. It's easier to nod, to sigh, to pretend the rumors are as natural as the weather. The wind is rising again. It prods the door with a slow, deliberate hand, as though reminding you it hasn't finished with you yet. The draft curls across the floor, lifting the fringe of your blanket. You press the cloth down and try not to wonder whether the old woman is cold where they've locked her. Expectation offers you the small comfort that you did nothing to harm her. Reality answers that you did nothing to help, either. You stare into the darkness, feeling the stories spreading small, invisible roots tangling through the village. You expect the tale will stay outside your door, but stories are like the wind. Once they find a crack, they slip in, making themselves comfortable whether you invite them or not. A neighbor raps gently on your shutters, just once, then lifts the latch without waiting. You flinch. He steps inside, shaking rain from his shoulders. He doesn't look at you when he speaks. He only says they've decided she must stay locked away until the priest returns. Maybe a week, maybe longer. You think he sounds tired. You think he sounds relieved to have something to do with the fear. Expectation suggests you'll argue. That you'll demand to know why, when she sank in the pond and proved nothing but her own exhaustion, she must still be held. But the words stay in your throat. You nod because it feels simpler than asking questions no one wants to answer. After he leaves, you bolt the door and lean your forehead against the wood. It feels as cold as the pond's edge. You tell yourself you are only one person, that there was never anything you could have done, but the wind doesn't care for your excuses. It finds the crack near the latch and pushes through with the slow confidence of something that knows it has all the time in the world. Expectation tells you this is the end of it. Reality rustles the rushes under your feet and whispers that this is only the part where the story begins to grow teeth. You might imagine that once the woman was locked away, the village would feel safer, that the air would lighten and the roofs would stay put. But the wind had other ideas. It lingered day after day, slapping the shutters and keening around the corners of your cottage, as if to make certain no one forgot why she was taken. Expectation whispers that this is coincidence, that storms come and go with no need for human meddling. Reality sounds more persuasive when the wind screams across the fields, flattening the barley and rattling every loose board in the parish. Each time the gusts rise, you watch your neighbours glance uneasily at each other, silently recalculating their doubts. You try to get on with the business of living. You mend a fence that fell in the first gale. You patch the thatch over your bed. You gather firewood, though it feels pointless when the wind steals the warmth before it can settle. But each core feels like theatre, as though you're pretending to be useful in a story that no longer requires you. Expectation tells you that if you stay busy, you won't have time to think. Reality provides you with hours to do nothing but consider how quickly a village can turn on someone who's always been there. You remember the old woman at the harvest, how she shared a cup of broth when your child was sick, how she once pulled a thorn from your hand without comment. You remember, and you try not to. At night, the wind presses at the door like a hand testing your resolve. It sifts through the thatch, strokes the ashes in the hearth until they scatter into ghosts. The draft drags the stories back into your mind, the same tales repeated in whispers all week. She cursed the weather. She brought the storm. She spoke to things no Christian should see. Expectation insists the wind will tire. Reality proves it has more stamina than any of you. On the sixth night, it tears the last of the shutters from your window. The cold tumbles in, as if it has been waiting for just that invitation. You shove a board across the gap, driving nails in with the heel of your hand, but you can't keep the noise out. You can't keep the certainty from growing in the dark. This was never about whether she was guilty. It was about whether anyone dared say she wasn't. You lie awake listening to the wind argue with the walls. It sounds almost gleeful now, like a child who has found a game no adult can stop. You tell yourself that if it doesn't calm by morning, you'll go to the elder. You'll ask why she must stay locked away, why no one has the courage to end it. Expectation tells you you'll follow through. Reality is less generous. When dawn comes, you will still be here, wrapped in your blanket, counting the hours since she was taken, and trying not to wonder how much longer you can pretend you're only an observer. You might believe that when the wind finally died, relief would rush in to fill the silence, that the village would exhale, rub its eyes, and remember itself as a collection of neighbours rather than a jury. But the morning after the gale subsides, the quiet feels no kinder than the storm. Expectation insists that the hush is peace. Reality proves it is only absence, the wind stepping aside to let shame have the floor. You step outside, squinting into the pale daylight. The roofs are stripped to their bones, fences scattered in tired heaps. It looks less like a village and more like a battlefield that never quite agreed on which side was winning. The road to the old woman's hut is churned to grey mud by all the feet that marched her away. You stand at the edge of it, your boots sinking with a soft, accusing squelch. You expect someone else will walk down that path first. That one of the men who held the rope will take up the work of explaining what happens next. But no one moves. Everyone has discovered the same sudden fascination with their own front doors. Expectation tells you there will be a plan. Reality provides only a hollow waiting. You imagine the old woman in that locked room, her shawl still damp from the pond, her eyes fixed on the shutter that doesn't close. You'd like to think she's plotting a defense, a protest, anything that might let you pretend she's fighting for herself so you don't have to. But the truth is simpler. She's just waiting. Someone clears their throat as though about to speak, but all that comes out is a thin cough, quickly swallowed. A dog barks in the distance, the sound bright and absurd in the hush. The wind doesn't return. It doesn't need to. It's already done what it came to do. Expectation suggests you'll find the courage to step forward, to say something small but true, to remind everyone that the weather is just weather. Reality feels heavier than your own coat, pressing your shoulders until you can't lift your head. And so you stand there, another silent witness. You tell yourself that later, after the roofs are mended and the fences righted, you'll speak up. You'll insist the story was never true, that none of this was necessary. But even as you make the promise, you feel how hollow it sounds. Expectation promises the memory will fade. Reality knows better. Years from now, when another storm rattles these same walls, you'll remember how easily fear outvotes reason, how quickly decency goes quiet, how the wind didn't have to carry a curse to ruin your sleep, it only needed to push you all a little closer to the edge. And as you turn away, the hush follows you like an unfinished sentence, reminding you that some silences never stop echoing. You might believe that a gust of air is nothing more than moving weather, an aimless wanderer that stirs the grass and rattles the shutters. But in the Middle Ages, wind wasn't just something that happened to you. It was something sent. A messenger dispatched from forces you couldn't see and didn't dare to name out loud. Expectation suggests you could ignore it, that if you kept your head down and your door latched, it would pass you by without noticing. Reality informs you the wind noticed everything. It crept under your eaves with the curiosity of a gossip, collecting your secrets like crumbs. It slipped through your hair, touched the back of your neck, and left you shivering with the uneasy certainty that someone was listening. People said the wind carried words. that the saints used it to convey warnings, that demons used it to spread confusion, that witches bound it in secret jars and loosed it over enemies in the dead of night. You remember the old shepherd, the one who smelled of turnips and pipe smoke, swearing that on a certain hill near the chapel, the wind spoke in voices that weren't human. You thought it was just his fondness for cheap ale, but lying awake on a stormy night, you weren't so sure. Expectation tells you that a draft is just a draft. Reality gives you the memory of a sudden gust slamming your door open when no hand was near, of the way your candle guttered out in a room with no one else breathing. You tried to tell yourself it was coincidence, but the thought never fit quite comfortably. The wind was also a punishment. You heard the sermons often enough that when a gale tore the roofs away, it was the Almighty sweeping clean the sins of the parish. When the rain flew sideways, pelting your face like thrown pebbles, you were supposed to feel chastened, repentant. But more often you just felt wet, cold, and faintly resentful that God's discipline arrived in such a draughty package. Expectation suggests you'd grow used to it, that after enough nights of listening to the wind circle your cottage, you'd stop imagining it carried any message but its own noise. But you never did. There was something in the way it moved around the corners of your house, testing every loose shutter, searching for a crack to slip inside. It felt personal. Once, during a winter that outstayed its welcome, you heard the wind singing, a high, thin voice weaving through the beams. You held your breath, listening for the words, certain they were meant for you. Even now, you can't say whether it was your imagination or something older, something that remembered your name before you learned to speak. Expectation says the wind is nothing. Reality whispers that it is everything you can't explain and everything you secretly suspect has always been watching. You might think that if the clergy said it often enough, you'd learn to believe the wind was sacred, that every draught was an instruction, every gale a sermon. But faith, like heat, never quite reaches every corner. Some nights, no matter how earnestly you prayed, you still suspected the wind just enjoyed the trouble it caused. Expectation tells you the priest knew what he was talking about. Reality offered you sermons that sounded suspiciously like guesses dressed in holy Latin. He would stand at the pulpit, voice rising and falling with practiced solemnity, explaining how the wind was God's breath sweeping impurity from your life. You listened because everyone did, but as the rain leaked through the roof and trickled cold down your spine, you wondered why divine breath felt so much like mildew. People insisted the wind was judgment, that it carried away the souls of the unrepentant, that when it slammed your shutters open in the middle of the night, it was a sign you'd been weighed and found wanting. You tried to remember every sin you hadn't confessed, every grudge you hadn't released, but the list was too long, and the wind was too eager to remind you. Expectation reassures you that the faithful are protected. Reality offers you the memory of the time a storm tore the steeple from the church itself. You were there, standing in the mud with the other villagers, watching the timbers splinter like matchsticks. No one spoke. No one dared to ask whether God's breath might be aimed at everyone. Sometimes you thought the wind had a particular fondness for testing your humility. It came nosing under your door when you felt proud. It rattled your shutters when you imagined you'd finally repaired them well. It slipped between your blankets whenever you thought you'd earned a night without shivering. Expectation insists that the wind is a punishment for sin. But when you lay awake listening to it sing through the rafters, it sounded less like anger and more like laughter, and old, tired laughter that didn't much care whether you believed or not. There were stories, of course. Old ones, older than the church, told in mutters around the hearth when the priest wasn't listening. That the wind was the breath of spirits who had never been human, that it moved across the world carrying memories no prayer could erase. You never said out loud that those stories made more sense than the sermons. But some nights, when you heard it whispering through the thatch, you felt closer to believing them than anything you'd ever heard from the pulpit. Expectation tells you you'll never admit that. Reality is the cold draft at your feet, the one that knows every secret you'd rather pretend you never thought. You might convince yourself that the wind had no voice, that it was only the noise of leaves, the sigh of air across loose thatch, the ordinary clatter of an ill-built cottage. But on nights when the moon was thin and the fire low, you knew better. Expectation tells you that the wind is mindless. Reality settles in when you hear your own name spoken in the hush between gusts. It's never loud, just a suggestion soft as a sigh, so subtle you could almost dismiss it as imagination. Almost, but not quite. People said the wind carried the last words of the dying, that if you listened, you might hear the regrets of a soul unwilling to leave. You tried not to think about that when you lay awake, blanket pulled over your ears, counting your own regrets like rosary beads. Once, when you were still young enough to be certain you'd live forever, you left the door unlatched in a storm. You thought the gale would find you daring. Instead, it found you shivering, your floor soaked in rain, and your courage shriveled to nothing. The wind had no face, no hands, but it felt personal the way it slipped around your shoulders, a cold arm pulling you close. Expectation insists you can't remember every night like that. But you do. You remember the particular whistle the gap in the shutter made when the wind came from the east. You remember the creak of the rafters, the taste of damp in the air. You remember how it felt to wonder if you were alone. The priest said the wind was a messenger, that sometimes it carried comfort, sometimes warning. But when you asked what the message was, he only smiled tight and uneasy and said some things were better not understood. You nodded, but the answer sat in your stomach like a lump of bad bread. Expectation suggests you'd grow braver as you aged. Reality proves that fear has a way of ripening over time, sweet and familiar as rot. You learned to lie still when the wind came calling, to pretend you were sleeping, to pretend you were deaf. But pretending never lasted long. There was always that moment just before sleep, just after the fire died, when you felt the draft slide across your cheek, and you knew without doubt that it was not simply air, that it had come to see whether you were listening, and whether this time you might finally answer. Expectation tells you never will. Reality waits patiently, certain that one night you will. You might think that confession ended when you left the chapel, that once you'd mumbled your list of petty misdeeds to the priest, the ledger was cleared. But on certain nights, when the wind prowled through the rafters, you suspected there was another account being kept, one that didn't require ink or parchment to remember your failings. Expectation tells you that guilt is a private thing, something you carry in your own chest. Reality comes whispering through the cracks, reminding you that nothing remains hidden forever, especially not in a village where walls are thin and the wind is always listening. It was said the breeze could carry words, that every careless insult, every whispered spite, every vow you never intended to keep was gathered up like crumbs and ferried to ears you'd rather avoid. You tried not to think of the old woman locked away after the storm, of how many times you'd nodded along to stories you didn't believe, of how the wind might have been there, slipping under the door, tucking those small betrayals into its pockets. Expectation insists you could not have done more. You were only one person, and the wind was an old, inevitable thing. Reality is the memory of your own voice joining the chorus of suspicion, soft enough that you could pretend it wasn't yours. Some nights, when the gusts grew strong enough to rattle the shutters, you imagined the wind carried every word ever spoken in anger, circling the village in a slow, invisible inventory of guilt. You pictured it brushing over the thatch, pausing at each door, listening. Expectation comforts you with the thought that the wind does not care, that it is nothing more than weather. But when you lie in the hush between gusts, you remember the stories. The ones that said the wind was the soul of the world itself, and that it never forgot a single syllable. You tell yourself that's nonsense. Superstition. But then you feel the draft against your cheek, colder than it has any right to be. You hear it curl around your hearth, testing the latch, searching for the smallest crack. Expectation says it will pass. Reality has no need to hurry. The wind is patient. It has all night to remind you of the things you'd rather forget. And so you lie still, listening to your own heart beating faster than it should, trying not to wonder whether the wind will carry this moment too, this quiet confession you never intended to make to someone who already suspects you have more to confess. You might expect that after so many nights spent listening to the wind mutter through the beams, you'd grow accustomed to its presence. That familiarity would breed something like indifference. But the wind had a particular talent for finding the one place you felt unguarded, the spot you'd forgotten to shield. Expectation tells you that the cold is the same everywhere, Reality shows you how it can change shape, how it can slip between your shoulder blades in a way that feels personal, as though it has been waiting patiently for just this moment to remind you you are softer than you pretend. People said that the wind could sense weakness, that if your faith was cracked, if your resolve had worn thin, it would find you first. You didn't believe that at first. How could something as ordinary as air be so cruel? But you remember the way it touched your skin on the morning. You lied to the elder, insisting you'd seen nothing at the pond. The draft that slipped across your throat felt almost approving. Expectation insists that regret is fleeting. That time wears it down to something smooth and harmless. But in the dark, when the wind slides under the door like an uninvited guest, you feel it all again. You remember exactly where you stood, the words you chose, the way your voice trembled in your own ears. You've tried to explain it to yourself, that you were tired, that you were afraid, that it would have made no difference. But the wind doesn't negotiate. It comes with the same slow persistence every night, testing the edges of your door, pressing at the latch, as if it knows you will always let it in eventually. Expectation comforts you with the thought that you have nothing left to confess. Reality is the way you startle every time the wind knocks something loose, a shutter, a bundle of thatch, your own composure. You'd think by now you'd be ready for it. You never are. Once, you sat up in bed and asked it half in anger, half in desperation what it wanted. The gust that answered smelled of wet earth and old wood, and it left you with the unsettling certainty that the wind doesn't want anything from you. It only comes to see whether you are still the same person who failed to speak. Expectation says you'll change. Reality has watched you long enough to know better. And so, you lie there, the blanket clutched around your shoulders like a promise you don't believe. You tell yourself you'll be braver when the next storm comes. But the wind listens to every thought, and you suspect it already knows that you won't. You might think that after a day spent stooped over the fields, your mind would be too tired to trouble itself with theology. That exhaustion would crowd out superstition, leaving no room for the old stories to rattle around in your head. But some nights, fatigue makes your thoughts sharper, not duller, sharp enough to cut you when you least expect it. Expectation tells you you've outgrown the tales, that the stories of spirits riding the gale are for children and the feeble-minded. Reality is the way you lie awake in the dark, replaying every sermon you ever heard about the wind. You remember the priest's voice, solemn as a bell, telling you the wind was the breath of God, that each gust was a test of faith, each storm a cleansing of pride. You tried to believe it. You tried to imagine the cold pressing under your door as a blessing, not a threat. But there was always something in the tone of those sermons that sounded more like a warning. Expectation comforts you that belief can be simple. Reality hands you memories of all the times you prayed and the wind only blew harder, as if answering in a language you'd never be holy enough to learn. When you were a child, you once asked whether the wind ever carried kindness, whether it could bring good news instead of ruin. The priest had hesitated, just long enough that you understood the answer was no, though he never said it. You spent years telling yourself that pause meant nothing. But now, in the hush before dawn, it feels like the truest thing you've ever been told. Expectation insists you can wall off these thoughts, that you can keep them behind some neat mental door. But the wind has a key to every lock you own. It finds the cracks, slips through, curls around your ribs until you remember every question you pretended not to ask. And so you lie there, listening to the roof creak under the pressure of invisible hands. You feel the draft brush your throat, deliberate as a finger. You try to remind yourself you're a grown person, that you don't believe the wind has intentions. But the words sound thin in your mouth, as if even your own voice doesn't trust them. Expectation promises you'll laugh at yourself come morning. Reality is the knowledge that when dawn arrives, you'll still be listening for that voice in the wind, the one you can almost understand if you're tired enough to forget what you've been taught. You might expect that confession was something you did with another person, a priest, a neighbor, anyone who could nod gravely and absolve you with a word. But some nights, when the wind pressed through the walls and pooled in the corners of your cottage, you found yourself speaking to it instead. Expectation tells you this was only loneliness, that you were tired, that your tongue loosened by cold and hunger. Reality is the memory of your own voice whispering into the dark, naming fears you never dared admit to the living. It always began the same way, you lying awake, watching the last cinder in the hearth fade to a sullen glow, the wind testing the latch, the thatch, the ragged edges of the door. You tried to pretend it was just the ordinary night sounds, but the longer you listened, the more it felt like an invitation. Expectation insists you never answered. But you did. One night, when the draft found the hollow of your throat and settled there, you heard yourself whispering apologies, thin, cracked words that tasted like stale bread. You said you were sorry for standing silent by the pond. Sorry for the gossip you let pass unchallenged. Sorry for the small cruelties you practiced simply because no one stopped you. The wind moved as you spoke, the chill sliding from your throat to your chest. You might have sworn it paused, as if considering your confession. You waited for something to happen, for the roof to cave, for the floor to split, for the air itself to scold you. But nothing did. The wind only breathed out again, cold and unburdened. Expectation says that should have comforted you. That unjudging silence is a kind of forgiveness. Reality shows you how much worse it felt to realize that the wind didn't care, that your remorse was just another noise it carried away, no more important than a loose shutter or the sigh of a dying ember. In the morning you told yourself you imagined it, that it was nothing more than weather, the same as any other night. But when you caught your reflection in the water bucket, you saw the truth in your own eyes. You had finally admitted what you were. Not a bystander, not a victim, just someone too afraid to speak. Expectation insists you'll never feel that helpless again. Reality is the draft under the door, reminding you that fear is a habit you haven't quite unlearned. You might think that by the time winter settled in earnest, the wind would have tired of you, that it would retreat to the hills or spend its rage on the cliffs by the sea. But that year, the gales never relented. Each dusk brought a fresh onslaught, as though the wind was determined to finish a lesson you hadn't learned. Expectation tells you that storms feel the same after a while. Cold is cold, noise is noise. Reality proves there are degrees to everything, and this was a night when the wind felt more like an enemy than a season. It started just after sunset, when the last smear of light vanished behind the trees. The gusts came in heaving waves, testing every seam in the roof, rattling the shutters until you thought they would fly off into the dark. You stuffed rags into the gaps, wedged a broken stool against the door. It didn't help. The draft found you anyway, sliding along the floor to paw at your ankles like some curious stray you hadn't the heart to chase away. Expectation comforts you with the idea that your preparations would matter. Reality is the moment you realized you'd spent hours shoring up a house that wasn't meant to keep anything out. Not the cold. Not the wind. Not your own guilt. You sat by the hearth, though the fire was barely aglow. Your hands were stiff, wrapped in the last scrap of wool you owned, and still the wind pressed against the door in slow, deliberate pulses, as if it knew you were listening and wanted to savor every creak of the hinges. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch snapped. You felt the thud through the walls, a reminder that the wind was no metaphor, no passing fancy. It was a force, and it did not care who you were or how sorry you had become. Expectation suggests that your fear would ebb with the hours. That fatigue would dull it into something manageable. But every time you thought it had spent itself, another gust came barreling through, louder than before. You began to imagine the wind was testing how long you could sit there without breaking. At some point near midnight, you pressed your palm to the door as it shuddered under another blow. You felt the cold on the other side and wondered what it would be like to step into it, to let the wind carry you wherever it was going, away from this place, from the memories and the stories and the unspoken accusations. Expectation tells you you would never do such a thing. Reality is the way you hesitated, just long enough to know the thought was real. When dawn came, thin and colourless, you were still there, hands wrapped around yourself like a promise you weren't sure you believed. The wind slipped away at last, unhurried, leaving you with a silence so complete it felt like a punishment all its own. You might think that after a night so raw, so thoroughly unpleasant, you'd rise with a new clarity, that the storm would have scoured something clean inside you, left you wiser or stronger, or at least a little braver. But when the pale daylight finally seeped into the cottage, all you felt was smaller. Expectation suggests dawn always feels like relief. Reality is the way you sat there on your stool, staring at the door you'd nearly opened, and wondered what that said about you. The fire was nothing but a quilt of grey ash. The rushes underfoot were damp and sour, with the memory of all the hours you spent sitting there, listening for your own breaking point. You told yourself you were tired, that anyone would have thought of stepping out into the dark if only to make the noise stop. But the wind had left a different story behind one that smelled of cold resignation and sounded like your own voice echoing in an empty room. Expectation insists you'd get up and start your day. Reality is the way you sat there so long your legs went numb, as if you were hoping if you held still enough, the night might erase itself. Eventually you stood. The door moved under your palm like something half asleep, heavy with damp. You pressed your forehead against it, feeling the leftover chill where the wind had lingered. You told yourself you were only checking the latch, but the truth was you needed to know it still held. Expectation tells you you'd never let the wind in again. Reality reminds you that you don't always get to decide who crosses your threshold. You stepped back and looked around the cottage, noticing every small failure at once: the crack above the lintel, the soot that never quite brushed off the wall, the thinness of the blanket you clutched like a talisman. Outside, the fields looked unchanged. The fences still sagged in the same apologetic angles. The puddles glistened in the grey morning, as if the storm had only just left. You'd expect that someone would be out there, tending to the damage, making a show of resilience. But the road was empty. It seemed no one was quite ready to pretend yet. Expectation comforts you that the worst is over. Reality is the way the silence feels thin, expectant, almost watchful, as though the wind has only stepped away to catch its breath. You closed the door at last and sat back on your stool. You waited for the warmth to return to your fingers. You waited for the feeling that you were safe again. Neither came, and when you finally began your day, boiling water that never quite heated, sweeping ash that refused to leave, you felt the hollow place the wind had carved inside you. A space that would echo every time the rafters creaked or the draft sighed under the door, reminding you how easy it was to consider stepping out into the dark and how much harder it was to stay. You might imagine that after so many nights of listening, the wind would lose its power to unsettle you. That repetition would dull your senses the way a dull blade refuses to cut, but familiarity never softened the way it moved through the rafters, never made the cold feel any less personal. Expectation tells you that you could make peace with it eventually, that you would find a way to hear it without feeling the old dread uncoil in your chest. Reality is the way your shoulders still tightened every time the draft swept over your cheek, as if it were sniffing you out, confirming you were still the same. People said the wind carried memories, that it scraped them from the walls, tugged them out of your breath, and carried them on to the next place. You didn't want to believe it, but you couldn't help imagining your own secrets drifting above the village, small, weightless confessions scattered among the clouds. Expectation comforts you with the thought that no one hears them, that the wind disperses them into nothing. Reality is the certainty that you will never know whose ears they might reach. You remember the first time you heard the wind speak your name or something close enough it made you sit up in the dark, heart hammering. You told yourself it was a trick of fatigue. You repeated that lie every time it happened again. But each time the syllables came, they felt clearer, closer. Expectation says you were dreaming. Reality is the taste of your own fear when you swallowed, and couldn't quite deny you'd heard it. In daylight you told no one. You fixed your fence, mended the thatch, boiled your bitter herbs as if the wind was no more meaningful than a draft under the door. But even then you caught yourself listening, waiting for the next time it would remember your name. Expectation insists you'll never answer, that you'll never stand in the yard and lift your face to the gale, ready to admit you believe it has a soul. But when the cold crept under your collar and pressed against your throat, you understood that some part of you already had. You learned to sleep lightly, ears tuned to every creak and sigh. You learned to brace your hands against the shutters when the gusts tried to tear them free. You learned that you could never truly shut it out. And in that quiet hour before dawn, when the fire had died and the world felt thin to a whisper, you learned the thing you could never unlearn, the that the wind was never empty. It was always carrying something: your regrets, your questions, the unspoken things that no sermon could absolve. Expectation promises you that one day you'll stop listening. Reality is the draft sliding across your skin right now, reminding you that you never will. You might imagine that in a castle, you'd be safe from the wind at last. That thick stone walls would offer a kind of certainty no cottage ever could. But the first time you stepped into the great hall and felt the draft slide across your ankles, you learned that stone has its own way of disappointing you. Expectation promises you that walls 3 feet thick will hold the cold outside. Reality is the way the chill seeps through every block, winding around you like a persistent accusation. The stones themselves feel alive, heavy and impassive, the way a sleeping ox feels alive, exhaling slow draughts of old air that never quite warms. In daylight, you tried to pretend the castle was grand. You admired the banners, the polished shields, the narrow windows with their wavy glass. But when dusk fell, the draught moved freely, prowling the corridors with the same careful curiosity you'd grown to know in your cottage. Expectation tells you that luxury is protection, that lords and ladies, with their servants and their wealth, must surely be insulated from such inconveniences. Reality is the memory of the steward huddled by the kitchen hearth, his hands cracked and raw from carrying firewood no blaze could ever quite conquer. At night, the wind used the walls like an instrument, finding every crevice, every forgotten arrow slit. It turned the corridors into long stone flutes, each note a reminder that you were still only human, still just one more soft thing trapped in a place built for endurance, not comfort. You learned to keep your cloak on even in bed. You learned to expect your breath to frost the air before you in the morning. You learned that stone doesn't care about your tired bones or your wish to feel safe. It only cares about standing where it was placed, year after year, collecting the cold. Expectation insists you can't feel smaller inside a castle than you did in a hut. Reality proves you can. There is a special humility in realizing the walls that protect you will never notice your gratitude or your shivering. And when you lie awake, the rushes beneath you stiff and dry as old straw, you can almost believe the castle is alive in its own way. That the wind has taught the stones to listen, to gather up the smallest sounds of your fear and keep them sealed in their depths, like fossils pressed into rock. Expectation tells you that dawn warmed the stones. Reality is the way they stay cold long after sunrise, as if they have no use for the sun at all. You might expect that in a castle, you'd find defenses against everything: raiders, hunger, the relentless wind. And for a moment, when you first saw the tapestries hanging in the hall, you thought you'd found a kind of refuge. Heavy cloth draped across the walls, scenes of hunts and battles woven in colours bright enough to trick you into feeling safer. Expectation tells you that such beauty must hold some warmth. Reality is the moment you brushed your hand across the wool and felt it cold as the stones behind it. A polite deception meant only to hide how little protection there really was. In the day, the tapestries stirred with every gust, their edges lifting like the hems of skirts. You tried to ignore it, tried to believe the drafts were smaller here, less personal. But at night, you'd lie on your thin pallet and watch them billow against the wall, as if the woven hunters were tired of their own endless chase and wanted out. Expectation suggests that the wind respects wealth, that it spares places built on coin and conquest. Reality is the way it moved through the high chambers, exactly as it did through your cottage, testing the latches, prodding the corners, curling into the hollow spaces behind every shield and banner. People said tapestries were the pride of the household, a sign that you were civilized. You knew better. They were decoration, not defense. They hung there collecting dust and cold, heavy with the smell of old dye and older moths. When you pressed your palm against one, it felt as indifferent as the wind itself. Expectation comforts you that at least you were indoors, that you had walls between you and the night. But sometimes you thought the wind liked to prove you wrong. It found every seam and every gap, slipping around the tapestries to remind you that no matter how thick the walls or how fine the cloth, you were still only an animal hoping the dark would leave you alone. You learned to stop hoping. You learned to watch the edges of the tapestries lift and fall, listening for the moment the wind's invisible hand found a new crack to pry open. You learned that some silences were worse than howling, that when the wind paused, it was only considering its next move. Expectation promises that the tapestries are enough. Reality is the knowledge that nothing woven by human hands can outlast the cold forever. And in those hours before dawn, when the castle seemed to hold its breath, you wondered whether the figures in the cloth envied you because at least you were allowed to shiver. You might expect that once you passed the tapestries and ducked into the corridor beyond, the wind would lose interest. That the narrow passage, with its heavy door and thick walls, would finally give you a place to catch your breath, but some spaces remember you too well to let you forget yourself. Expectation tells you the corridor was only a hallway, a practical connection between rooms. Reality is how it felt at night, a stone throat waiting to swallow your footsteps. You tried not to walk it after sunset. You told yourself it was foolish, that you were too old to be unsettled by a draft. But every time you passed beneath the small archway, you felt the hush pressing against your ears, a silence so complete it sounded louder than the wind itself. Expectation promises that darkness is darkness, the same in any room. Reality shows you that some darkness knows how to look back. The corridor was narrow enough that your elbows brushed the cold walls, smooth from the touch of countless hands. You wondered if any of them ever felt as unsteady as you did. The torches were set far apart, so that every few paces you stepped into shadow. You told yourself the shadows were empty, but the wind found them easily, slipping along the floor to taste your ankles, reminding you that you were never quite alone. Expectation insists you could hurry through. Reality is the knowledge that moving faster only made your heart beat louder in your ears, as if it, too, was afraid. You learned to walk slowly, to keep your gaze steady on the pinprick of light at the far end, as though that small flame was the only proof the world was still intact. Sometimes you fancied you heard a sigh behind you, a soft exhale of something older than stone. You never turned around. You told yourself there was nothing there, that the castle didn't care who passed through its passages. But the thought never quite held together. Expectation tells you the corridor was indifferent. Reality is the way it seemed to notice every thought you carried with you, every regret you hadn't set down. You could feel them pressed against your spine as you walked, as though the dark was reading them one by one. When you reached the end, when you stepped into the flickering circle of lamplight, you always exhaled a little too loudly, like someone waking from a dream. You'd expect the feeling to fade as you moved on, but it never did. You carried it into the next room, and the one after that, the sense that the corridor was still behind you, listening. Expectation suggests you'll grow used to it. Reality is the certainty that some places never stop waiting. You might expect that if you finally reached a chamber with a real bed, a fire, and a thick door that latched tight, you'd feel safe. That all the corridors and gusts and whispered drafts would stay politely on the other side of the threshold. But the first time you closed yourself in and heard the wind testing the latch, you realized stone doesn't stop a memory from following you inside. Expectation tells you that comfort is something you can count, like the number of blankets on your bed or the height of the fire in the hearth. Reality is the way your heart still beat too fast, how the shadows pulled in the corners as though they were listening. You sat on the edge of the bed, cloak still around your shoulders, staring at the embers. They glowed a dull red, promising warmth they never quite delivered. You told yourself you'd take off your boots, lie down, let your eyes close. But the thought of closing your eyes felt too much like trust, and you had precious little of that left. Expectation insists the chamber was secure. Reality proved that nothing with a door can ever be entirely certain. You watched the latch tremble each time the wind pressed against it, and you wondered if the whole castle was just a larger version of your cottage, more stone to pretend you were protected, but no more proof you really were. Once the steward told you that the castle had stood for generations, that its walls were built thicker than any man's fear. You almost believed him. But on nights like this, when the wind found every gap, it felt as if the stones themselves were weary of standing and would let the cold in simply because holding it out was too much work. Expectation comforts you with the thought that dawn was coming. Reality is the stretch of hours before dawn, when the fire sank lower and the wind grew bolder, rattling the shutters with the casual malice of something that had all the time in the world. You pulled the blanket around you, the fabric heavy and scratchy on your skin. You tried to imagine that it was enough to keep the cold out. But when you drew a slow breath, you could taste the same draft you'd known in every place you'd ever tried to rest a thin, searching cold that never tired of finding you. Expectation tells you that morning would make you braver. Reality is the way you listen to the wind slip around the corners of the door, reminding you that even here you were never beyond its reach. And when your head finally sank to the pillow, you closed your eyes only because there was nothing else left to do. You expected sleep to be a mercy. But the last thing you felt was the cold brushing your throat, a reminder that even in the grandest chamber, you were only a guest, and the wind was the true master. You might believe that a castle window was more trustworthy than the holes in a cottage wall, that the stone frames, the thick wooden shutters, the little panels of wavy glass were all designed to hold the world outside. But you learned quickly that a window is just another way for the wind to remind you who is in charge. Expectation insists that once you latch the shutter, you'd have peace. Reality is the soft, patient rattle that never stopped. You could press your palm to the wood and feel the cold pressing back, determined to slip around the edges to find the sliver of space you hadn't sealed. The steward said the windows were a luxury, imported glass more precious than salt. You tried to admire them by daylight, the way they caught the sun in their uneven surfaces. But at night, the panes looked like watchful eyes, reflecting the glow of your candle in a way that made you feel observed. Expectation comforts you that the glass was too thick for sound to pass through. Reality is the way you heard the wind anyway, sighing along the stone sill, finding every gap to slip through. You could almost believe it had learned your name by now, the way it never failed to seek you out. You told yourself you were imagining it, that you were tired, and the day's work had made you fanciful. But when you lay down, you could hear it tracing the seams of the shutter, tapping with the quiet insistence of a guest that refused to leave. Expectation suggests that if you ignored it, it would give up. Reality is the way the tapping grew louder each time you closed your eyes. You pulled the blanket over your ears, but the cold found you anyway, seeping through the cloth, sliding along your scalp like a curious hand. Sometimes you wondered if the wind was trying to tell you something, if all the rattling and the sighing were words you didn't understand, but you never asked aloud. You were afraid that if you did, the wind might finally answer, and you were not certain you wanted to hear what it would say. Expectation tells you you'll forget this feeling by morning, that it will shrink in the light like a bad dream. Reality is the way you kept listening for hours, even as the fire sank to a single ember, and when dawn came at last, pale and unsympathetic, you looked at the window and felt a thin thread of gratitude that it had stayed closed at all. You expected that should feel like a victory, but standing there in your own cold breath, you understood it was only another compromise the wind hadn't stopped trying. It had merely decided to wait. You might expect that in a grand stone hall ceiling arched like the ribs of some enormous beast your steps would echo, that you'd hear your own presence reflected back to you, proof you were not invisible. But the castle had places where sound simply failed, swallowed by the cold or carried off by drafts you could never see. Expectation suggests that a place so large would feel less personal, that you'd be able to walk from one end to the other without imagining that the walls were listening. Reality is the hush that fell the moment you crossed the threshold, a hush so deep it made you hesitant to breathe. By day, the hall was imposing banners draped like sagging promises, the hearth smoking just enough to remind you how far the fire had to stretch to warm the air. At night it became something else entirely, a hollow throat waiting to collect whatever you dared to say. Expectation insists you were alone. Reality is the way the air shifted around your ankles, cool and inquisitive, like a cat circling a stranger. You paused, waiting for the wind to howl or sigh. But there was no sound, just the quiet that pressed against your skin until it felt heavy. You tried to cross quickly, your boots tapping on the worn flagstones. But every footstep felt muffled, as if the cold had laid a hand on your shoulder to hush you. You thought of all the stories told about castles, the betrayals whispered in corners, the secrets traded behind tapestries, and wondered how many of them were still suspended in the air, waiting for someone to listen. Expectation comforts you that silence is safe, Reality shows you that silence can be its own kind of threat. You reach the far end of the hall, but when you turn to look back, you almost expected to see someone following some echo of yourself you'd left behind. When you finally reached the stair, you rested your hand on the cold iron railing, feeling the chill seep into your palm. You expected the climb would warm you, that the motion alone would drive out the dread, but each step felt heavier than the last, as though the hush below was reluctant to let you go. Expectation tells you you'll laugh about it later. That fear is lighter in the daylight. Reality is the certainty that if you walked that hall again tonight, the silence would still be waiting, patient as the wind, ready to slip around you and steal your voice once more. And when you reached the chamber door at the top, your hand hesitated on the latch. You told yourself it was only fatigue, but you knew the truth. You were afraid that when you closed the door, the hush would find a way to follow you inside. You might imagine that after so many hours spent wandering draughty halls and stairwells, any chamber with a hearth would feel like sanctuary. That the moment you stepped inside and bolted the door, the cold would surrender, and you'd finally be able to remember what it felt like to be merely tired, not hunted. Expectation tells you that firelight is enough. Reality is the way the flames licked the logs but never seemed to touch the air. You held your hands out, watched your own fingers illuminated in orange, and still felt the cold creep along your wrists, like a reminder you couldn't quite shake. The hearth itself was enormous, a black-mouthed thing that looked as though it might swallow the room if it ever bothered to burn properly. You'd fed it handful after handful of splintery wood, coaxing the embers to life with the determined desperation of someone who needed proof the dark could be held at bay. Expectation suggests that heat is a simple equation. Fuel plus flame equals comfort. Reality proves that stone walls drink warmth like water, that every bit of heat you gave the room vanished into the mortar, leaving you with nothing but the illusion of safety. You wrapped the cloak tighter around your shoulders, the fabric still smelling faintly of smoke and wool grease. You tried to believe that you were secure here, that the thick walls had finally done their duty. But the wind found a way, as it always did. You felt it slide along the floorboards, a low sigh that skimmed the soles of your boots before disappearing under the bed. Expectation comforts you with the thought that dawn was closer than it felt. But the night stretched out behind you, and you knew better than to think it had tired of testing you. You wondered how many others had sat in this same chamber, hands extended to the fire, praying the cold would respect the boundary between inside and out. Once, you fancied you heard the wind speaking, not a howl or a whistle, but a soft, untranslatable murmur that made you lean forward, as though you might catch the meaning if you listened closely enough. You never did. You weren't sure you wanted to. Expectation says you will forget this discomfort. That memory will smooth it into something manageable. Reality is the way your bones still ached from the chill, even after you crawled under the blanket, the way you held yourself rigid, afraid to move and lose whatever thin warmth you'd managed to collect. And when your eyes finally closed, you knew the wind would still be there when you woke, patient, tireless, ready to remind you again that no fire ever quite reaches the corners of a room built to outlast you. You might expect that a castle door thick oak strapped with iron would be the final defense against the wind, that when you turned the heavy key in the lock, you'd be sealing yourself inside something solid, something the night couldn't touch. But the first time you laid your palm against it and felt the draft breathe through the seam, you understood how easily certainty dissolves. Expectation tells you the door is a barrier. Reality is the way it flexed in its frame every time the wind leaned against it, as though the wood itself was tired of pretending. The hinges complained in long, drawn-out sighs, a protest that had no conviction. You listened to them creak each time the gusts pressed harder, and you felt the cold slide under the threshold to pool around your ankles. You tried to tell yourself it was a small thing, just air, just winter, but the shiver that ran up your spine felt older than the season. Expectation comforts you with the idea that if you ignored the draft, it would stop. But the wind had the patience of an old creditor. It waited in the cracks, testing every inch of the latch, tapping the boards in slow, thoughtful rhythms. Once, you woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something rattling against the wood soft, like a hand brushing across it. You didn't open your eyes. You held your breath and told yourself it was a branch, a loose shutter, anything but what you suspected, that the wind had found you again. Expectation insists you were imagining things. Reality is the way you lay there listening, every part of you tensed, convinced that if you so much as shifted, the door would sigh open to admit whatever waited beyond it. By dawn, you rose stiff and hollow, the taste of old fear lingering in your throat. You pressed your hand to the door again, half expecting it to lean into your touch like a living thing. It didn't, but the cold still seeped through, reminding you that it never really left. Expectation says you can mend the gap's new caulking, fresh straw, a tighter latch. Reality is the knowledge that the wind will always find another way in. It doesn't matter how many times you swear you've made the door secure. And so you dressed by the grey light filtering through the shutters, telling yourself that today you'd feel stronger. But as you lifted the latch and pulled the door open, the first breeze of morning slipped past you with the quiet familiarity of something that had been waiting all along. You might expect that stepping into the courtyard would feel like escape, that the moment you left the hush of the chambers behind, the open air would clear your head. But the first time you crossed the threshold and heard your footsteps vanish into the space, you understood that some silences were deeper outdoors. Expectation tells you that fresh air is a relief. Reality is the courtyard in winter, where the wind has all the room it needs to gather speed, circling the walls with a slow, deliberate menace. The stones underfoot were slick with frost, the cracks filled with old ice that never seemed to thaw. You moved carefully, the soles of your boots skidding just enough to keep your heart unsettled. The walls rose around you, taller than any trees, taller than the memory of trees. You felt them pressing in, not to protect you, but to keep the cold from wandering off. Expectation insists the courtyard is empty. Reality is the way you felt watched, though you couldn't say by whom. You looked up at the narrow windows, their dark mouths gaping, and half expected a face to lean out, just long enough to confirm that you were not alone. Once you tried to speak, to say something trivial, anything to break the weight of it, but the wind snatched your words before they left your lips, folding them into its own muttering and carrying them away. You closed your mouth, tasting the metallic cold, and decided there was no point trying again. Expectation comforts you that the wind doesn't care about you personally, but it circled you as you stood there, stirring your cloak, tugging the loose threads from your sleeves with the precision of fingers. You imagined it cataloguing you, one more shape to remember when the sun went down. You turned to leave, but the wind pressed against your chest like a hand, just firm enough to make you hesitate. You told yourself it was only air, that it couldn't mean anything. But when you looked back at the empty windows, the thought didn't feel convincing. Expectation says you'll grow used to the courtyard. That repetition will make it feel ordinary. Reality is the certainty that each time you cross it, you'll feel smaller than the last. And when you finally stepped inside again, closing the door with hands you wished were steadier, you felt the wind slip past your heel, as if to prove it could follow you anywhere. You might expect that dawn would look different here. That when the first grey light crept over the parapets, you'd feel something like relief, or maybe even gratitude. But the morning in a castle is much the same as the night, just quieter about its intentions. Expectation tells you that sunrise is a promise. Reality is the way the cold stayed settled in the stones, the draft still sliding across the floor as if it hadn't noticed the sky had changed. You sat by the hearth, your hands curled around a cup of broth gone tepid before you could drink it. The fire had died hours before, leaving only a smear of ash and a few coals that refused to glow. You thought about stirring them back to life, but you were tired in a way that felt older than your body, tired in your bones, in your thoughts, in the part of you that used to believe morning would fix anything. Expectation suggests you would feel victorious simply for enduring the night. But the only thing you felt was the thin ache of having survived something you couldn't name. Outside the narrow window, the wind made its slow circuits of the courtyard, testing the shutters with the same patient confidence it had shown at midnight. You imagined it pausing there, taking inventory of all the small failures it had found in you over the dark hours. Expectation insists the daylight would banish that feeling. Reality is the way you still felt watched, even as the pale sky brightened over the battlements. You wondered if the stones themselves had learned to listen, if each time you exhaled in fear or whispered your doubts, the cold walls tucked those sounds away like a collection. When you finally stood, your legs felt unsteady, as though the floor had shifted while you were sitting. You wrapped your cloak tighter and told yourself you were simply chilled. But the truth was simpler. You no longer trusted the walls to hold still any more than you trusted them to keep the wind out. Expectation tells you that the day ahead will be easier now that the dark has passed. Reality is the understanding that dawn doesn't end anything, it only shows you how much still needs enduring. And as you stepped into the corridor, the wind met you there, slipping under your collar with the familiar confidence of something that never needed permission to follow. You paused, one hand on the cold stone wall, feeling it solid beneath your palm and knowing, without a doubt, that even here among all this thick masonry and ceremony you were no more protected than you'd ever been. Expectation promises you that one day you'll wake to find you don't feel this small. Reality is the draft at your heel, reminding you that some mornings are just another version of the night. So here you are, after all these hours spent wandering through wind-haunted corridors, low cottages with thatched roofs that never learned loyalty, and the great, cold halls of castles that pretended to protect you. You have listened to the gusts slip under doors, curl around your ankles, and test the quiet spaces where your doubts were hiding. You have learned perhaps more than you wished that the wind was never simply air. It was a presence, patient and familiar, as old as any wall you ever leaned against for comfort. As the story eases toward its close, allow yourself to soften your breathing. Let your eyes grow heavier, the corners of the room fading into the hush that comes when the telling is done. Feel the warmth you have managed to gather thin, as it sometimes seems, and trust that it will hold you for a little while longer. Thank you for staying here until the end, for sharing these slow hours and these quiet confessions. You are welcome to return any night you need reminding that survival is not always triumphant, but it is always something to be honored. If you feel ready, you can drift off now, knowing that the wind outside is only doing what it has always done, circling, listening, waiting for dawn. And you know it will repeat tomorrow, as it always does.